Tonight, we travel to the shores of a vast inland sea. Not an ocean, though it may seem like one when standing along its edge. Before us stretches Lake Michigan, its waters fading into the horizon beneath soft clouds and changing skies. Along its western shore rises one of the great cities of North America, a city of steel and stone, railroads and rivers, neighborhoods and dreams. This is Chicago. Today, Chicago is known for its soaring skyline, its deep-dish pizza, its sports teams, and its unmistakable presence along the waterfront. Millions of people call it home. Trains rumble beneath downtown streets. Boats drift through the river canyon formed by skyscrapers. The city hums with energy from morning until long after sunset. But Chicago was not always a city. Long before the first skyscraper pierced the sky, before the railroads converged here, before the stockyards, factories, and famous avenues, this place was something very different. Thousands of years ago, the land beside Lake Michigan was a world of tall grasses and wetlands. Prairies stretched for miles beneath open skies. Rivers wound slowly through marshes and forests. Deer moved through the grasslands. Waterfowl gathered in enormous numbers. The landscape was shaped by ancient glaciers that had retreated long before human memory, leaving behind fertile soil and one of the largest freshwater systems on Earth. The story of Chicago begins not with buildings, but with geography. There was something special about this location. Here, near the southwestern corner of Lake Michigan, travelers could move between two enormous systems of waterways. A short overland route connected rivers flowing toward the Great Lakes with rivers flowing toward the Mississippi River and eventually the Gulf of Mexico. For centuries, indigenous peoples understood the importance of this connection. Long before maps were drawn by Europeans, native communities traveled these routes, traded goods, exchanged ideas, and built relationships across vast distances. The land that would become Chicago sat at an important crossroads, a meeting place where cultures, goods, and stories could move between regions. Later came explorers. French traders and missionaries arrived in the 17th century, navigating unfamiliar waterways and recording their journeys. They recognized what indigenous peoples had already known. This place possessed extraordinary potential. Yet even then, few could have imagined what would eventually rise here. The early settlement was little more than a collection of trading posts and scattered structures beside muddy trails. The ground itself often seemed unsuitable for a great city. Parts of the area were marshy and flood-prone. Spring rains transformed roads into rivers of mud. Mosquitoes filled the air during warmer months. Visitors sometimes described the settlement in unflattering terms. And yet, people kept arriving. They came because of opportunity. They came because of trade. They came because of the promise created by geography. As the 19th century unfolded, Chicago began growing at a remarkable pace. Canals connected waterways. Railroads stretched across the continent. Grain from farms, lumber from forests, and goods from distant markets all flowed through the city. The growth was so rapid that even residents struggled to keep up with the changes. Entire neighborhoods appeared seemingly overnight. Streets expanded. Businesses multiplied. New arrivals poured in from across the United States and around the world. Then came disaster. In 1871, a devastating fire swept through much of the city, destroying thousands of buildings and leaving many residents homeless. For a moment, it seemed possible that Chicago's extraordinary rise might come to an abrupt end. Instead, the city rebuilt. And in rebuilding, it transformed itself. Architects experimented with new ideas. Engineers developed innovative methods of construction. Chicago became a laboratory for modern urban design and eventually helped give birth to the skyscraper. The city's skyline rose higher and higher. Its neighborhoods became home to immigrants from Ireland, Germany, Poland, Italy, Sweden, Bohemia, and countless other places. Each community brought traditions, languages, foods, music, and customs that helped shape the character of the city. Chicago became not just a city, but many cities woven together. Its history includes stories of industry and innovation, of migration and culture, of resilience and reinvention. It is a story carried by rivers and railroads, a story shaped by fire and water, a story told through architecture, music, neighborhoods, and generations of people seeking opportunity along the edge of a great lake. Over the next few hours, we will travel through that story together. We'll begin long before the first permanent settlement, exploring the ancient landscape and the indigenous communities who lived here for centuries. We'll meet traders, explorers, laborers, architects, immigrants, and dreamers. We'll walk muddy frontier roads, visit bustling 19th-century markets, witness the rebuilding of a city after catastrophe, and watch as steel towers rise into the sky. And through it all, we'll move at a gentle pace. This is not a tale of rushing from one dramatic event to the next. Instead, we'll take our time. We'll notice the details. The sound of wind moving through prairie grass. The creak of wooden docks beside the river. The glow of lanterns reflected on muddy streets. The distant whistle of a train arriving in the night. So wherever you are, get comfortable. Perhaps dim the lights. Settle into your favorite chair, your couch, or your bed. Allow the noise of the day to drift away. As the waters of Lake Michigan lap quietly against the shore, we'll begin our journey into the history of Chicago, the city by the lake. And our story starts long before there was a city at all. Long before there was a city called Chicago, before roads and railways crossed the landscape, before ships filled the harbor and skyscrapers reflected the sunlight, there was only the land. And what a remarkable land it was! If we could travel back thousands of years and stand where downtown Chicago now rises, we would find ourselves in a world that looked almost entirely different from today. There would be no skyline, no bridges, no streets. Instead, stretching in every direction would be an immense natural landscape shaped by powerful forces over countless generations. The story begins with ice. Many thousands of years ago, during the last ice age, enormous glaciers covered much of North America. These vast sheets of ice moved slowly across the continent, carving valleys, reshaping hills, and leaving behind new landscapes in their wake. The glaciers that once covered the Great Lakes region were difficult to imagine in size. In some places they were thousands of feet thick, towering over the land like frozen mountains. For centuries they advanced and retreated. Then, as the climate gradually warmed, the ice began to melt. The retreating glaciers left behind vast quantities of water that eventually formed the Great Lakes. Lake Michigan emerged from this process, becoming one of the largest freshwater lakes in the world. The landscape around it was transformed. Rivers found new paths. Wetlands developed. Rich soils accumulated. And over time, an extraordinary ecosystem began to flourish. Tallgrass prairie became one of the defining features of the region. Today, it is difficult to appreciate just how immense these prairies once were. Before widespread settlement, seas of grass stretched across much of the Midwest. Some grasses grew taller than a person standing upright. In summer, the prairie moved like waves beneath the wind. Golden sunlight shimmered across millions of stems. Wildflowers painted the landscape with bursts of color. Purple coneflowers, blazing stars, prairie clover, and countless other plants thrived in the fertile soil. The air buzzed with insects. Birds nested among the grasses. Small mammals darted through hidden pathways beneath the vegetation. The prairie was not empty wilderness. It was a living, interconnected world. To the east lay Lake Michigan. To the west stretched grasslands and forests. Between them flowed rivers that connected distant places. Among the most important of these waterways was the Chicago River. Today the river winds through the heart of a major city, but long ago it followed a quieter course through marshes and wetlands. It was here that geography created one of North America's most valuable natural crossroads. The rivers flowing toward the Great Lakes came remarkably close to rivers flowing toward the Mississippi River system. At certain times of year, especially during periods of heavy rain or flooding, the divide between these watersheds could become surprisingly small. A traveler could carry a canoe across a short stretch of land and move from one vast water network to another. This route became known as the Chicago Portage. The word portage refers to carrying boats and supplies over land between navigable waterways. Though simple in concept, the Chicago Portage connected two enormous parts of the continent. One direction led toward the Atlantic Ocean through the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River. The other direction led south through the Mississippi River all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Long before modern transportation, this connection was extraordinarily valuable, and indigenous peoples understood its importance. For thousands of years before Europeans arrived, native communities lived throughout the region. Archaeological evidence shows human activity in the Great Lakes area stretching back many thousands of years. Generations of people hunted, fished, gathered plants, traded goods, and built communities across the landscape. The land around present-day Chicago was home to several indigenous groups over different periods of history. Among those most closely associated with the region were the Potawatomi, Miami, and Illinois peoples. These communities possessed deep knowledge of the environment. They understood seasonal changes. They knew where fish gathered in rivers and lakes. They recognized which plants could be used for food, medicine, and shelter. They followed migration patterns of animals and adapted to the rhythms of nature. Life was closely connected to the land. During different seasons, families and communities moved to take advantage of available resources. Fishing was especially important along waterways. Whitefish, perch, sturgeon, and many other species provided food throughout the year. The surrounding forests offered deer, turkey, and smaller game. Wild rice could be harvested from wetlands. Berries ripened during summer months. Maple trees provided sap that could be transformed into sweeteners. The landscape was not merely occupied. It was carefully managed. Many indigenous communities used controlled burns to maintain portions of the prairie and woodland environment. These carefully planned fires helped encourage certain plant species, improved hunting conditions, and reduced the buildup of dense vegetation. The result was a landscape shaped not only by nature, but also by generations of human stewardship. Trade networks connected communities across remarkable distances. Copper from the Great Lakes region traveled hundreds of miles. Shells from distant coasts appeared far inland. Stories, traditions, and knowledge moved alongside physical goods. The Chicago Portage became one link in these broader networks. Travelers passing through the area might encounter people from many different communities. Languages mixed. Goods changed hands. News spread from village to village. The region served as a meeting place long before it became a city. Imagine a quiet evening beside the river. A canoe rests along the shoreline. Smoke rises gently from cooking fires. The sounds of insects drift through the prairie grasses. For countless generations, scenes much like this unfolded across the landscape. These natural features would eventually draw explorers, traders, settlers, and entrepreneurs from around the world. But that chapter of the story still lay far in the future. For now, the prairie remained vast and quiet. The winds continued to ripple through the grasses. The rivers followed their ancient courses. And along the shores of Lake Michigan, the first chapter of Chicago's story unfolded beneath open skies and endless horizons. As the 17th century dawned across North America, the land that would one day become Chicago remained much as it had for generations. The prairies still stretched toward distant horizons. The rivers continued their slow journeys between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi watershed. For the indigenous peoples of the region, these waterways were familiar routes connecting communities across vast distances. But now, new travelers were beginning to arrive. Far to the east, European nations were competing to explore and claim territory throughout North America. Among them was France, whose explorers had gradually pushed deeper into the interior of the continent. Unlike some colonial settlements that grew along the Atlantic coast, French exploration often followed rivers. Waterways were the highways of the 17th century. As a result, French explorers became increasingly fascinated by the vast network of rivers and lakes that stretched across the continent's interior. One of the earliest Europeans to glimpse the possibilities of this region was the explorer and cartographer Louis Joliet. Alongside the missionary Jacques Marquette, he undertook a remarkable journey in 1673. Their goal was to learn more about the great Mississippi River. Traveling by canoe, they journeyed through the Great Lakes and eventually reached the mighty river itself. Along the way, they encountered numerous indigenous communities, relying on local knowledge to navigate unfamiliar territory. Their expedition revealed valuable information about the geography of North America. For European powers interested in trade, transportation, and influence, such information was immensely valuable. As French explorers learned more about the region, they became increasingly interested in a small but important route near the southwestern shore of Lake Michigan. This was the Chicago Portage. At first glance, the portage did not seem especially impressive. There was simply a relatively short stretch of land connecting two enormous drainage systems. Yet this modest crossing represented something extraordinary. The route connected regions separated by thousands of miles. In an age when transportation depended heavily on rivers, such a connection was priceless. French traders quickly recognized its importance. The fur trade was becoming one of the most significant economic activities in New France. European demand for beaver pelts and other furs remained strong, and traders sought efficient routes for moving goods between indigenous communities and distant markets. The Chicago Portage offered exactly that. Imagine a small group of voyagers arriving by canoe. The voyagers were professional canoe men, famous throughout New France for their endurance and skill. Their long canoes carried trade goods, tools, and supplies. Generation after generation of travelers continued to use the route. The rewards outweighed the challenges. As more French traders passed through the region, informal networks developed between Europeans and indigenous communities. Trade relationships expanded. Goods flowed in multiple directions. Alongside physical goods came ideas, languages, and cultural exchange. The region around present-day Chicago remained sparsely populated by European standards, but it was becoming increasingly connected to wider economic systems. Throughout these years, missionaries also traveled through the area. Many French priests sought to establish relationships with indigenous communities while spreading Christianity. Their journeys often took them through remote regions rarely visited by Europeans. Missionary accounts provide some of the earliest written descriptions of the landscape surrounding the future site of Chicago. They described prairies stretching beyond sight. They wrote about rivers, marshes, wildlife, and the challenges of travel. Reading these accounts today offers a glimpse into a world largely untouched by urban development. Travel was rarely easy. Spring rains could flood low-lying areas. Winter brought snow and ice. Summer heat encouraged clouds of insects. Yet despite these hardships, explorers continued returning. They understood that this region occupied a unique geographic position. Over time, maps improved. Knowledge accumulated. The area slowly became more familiar to European traders and officials. Still, for many years Chicago remained less a settlement than a crossroads. People passed through more often than they stayed. Indigenous families moved through familiar seasonal routes. Missionaries journeyed between distant communities. The landscape itself remained dominant. Nature set the pace. Travelers adapted to the rhythms of weather, water levels, and seasons. The importance of the portage became especially clear during wet periods. Heavy rains sometimes caused waterways to expand and merge, making travel easier between river systems. At other times, low water levels required longer carries across muddy ground. Those who knew the land best possessed a tremendous advantage. For this reason, indigenous knowledge remained essential. European explorers frequently relied upon native guides who understood the rivers, trails, and seasonal changes of the region. Without that knowledge, many expeditions would have struggled to succeed. As the 18th century approached, the Chicago area occupied a fascinating position. It was still far from becoming a town. There were no permanent streets, no government buildings, no harbor crowded with ships. Yet the foundations of future growth were quietly taking shape. The route connecting the Great Lakes and Mississippi systems continued attracting attention. Traders recognized its value. Explorers recorded its location. Maps increasingly highlighted its significance. The landscape itself was revealing a secret that would eventually transform the region. This place was connected. Connected to lakes. Connected to rivers. Connected to trade routes stretching across much of North America. Long before railroads and highways, geography was already pointing toward Chicago's future. The prairie winds still blew across open grasslands. The river still wound through marshes toward the lake. Voyagers continued carrying their canoes across muddy ground. And beneath the vast Midwestern sky, the quiet crossroads beside Lake Michigan was slowly becoming known to the wider world. The city itself remained decades away, but the first threads of its future story were beginning to gather along the portage, where waters met, travelers crossed paths, and the continent seemed just a little bit smaller. As the 18th century drew toward its final decades, the quiet crossroads beside Lake Michigan remained a place of movement rather than permanence. Travelers passed through. Traders exchanged goods. Canoes appeared and disappeared along the waterways. The prairie winds continued their endless journey across the grasslands. Yet slowly, almost imperceptibly, something was beginning to change. The land that had long served as a gateway between waters was about to gain its first permanent non-indigenous resident. And with him, the earliest chapter of Chicago as a settled community would begin. His name was Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable. Today, Point du Sable is widely recognized as the founder of Chicago. Yet for many years, his remarkable story received far less attention than it deserved. Much about his early life remains uncertain. Historians believe he was born sometime around the middle of the 18th century in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, on the island that is now divided between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. His father is believed to have been French, while his mother was of African descent. At a time when much of the Atlantic world was shaped by colonial empires and slavery, Point du Sable's journey would take him thousands of miles from the Caribbean to the interior of North America. By the 1770s, he had become involved in the fur trade and the vast network of commerce that connected indigenous communities, French traders, British merchants, and frontier settlements. He was known as a skilled trader and entrepreneur. More importantly, he understood something that many others were beginning to realize. The Chicago River sat in an extraordinarily valuable location. At some point during the late 18th century, Point du Sable established a trading post near the mouth of the Chicago River. The exact date remains debated, but by the 1780s his settlement was clearly established and thriving. Unlike temporary camps or seasonal trading stations, this was a permanent home. The settlement is modest by modern standards, yet impressive for its time and place. Point du Sable's property included a substantial house, storage buildings, a barn, workshop spaces, and other structures needed to support both family life and commerce. For travelers arriving after long journeys, it would have appeared as a welcome sign of stability in a largely undeveloped landscape. The trading post became a gathering place. Fur traders stopped there while moving through the region. Indigenous communities visited to exchange goods. Travelers found shelter, supplies, and information. The settlement occupied a strategic location where people from many different backgrounds crossed paths. In many ways, Point du Sable's life reflected the diversity of the frontier itself. He married a Potawatomi woman named Kittihawa, who was later baptized as Catherine. Together they raised a family and built a life that bridged multiple cultures. Their household existed at the intersection of indigenous traditions, European trade networks, and the emerging frontier economy. Such multicultural communities were common in portions of the Great Lakes region, where cooperation often proved essential for survival and success. Life at the trading post followed the rhythms of the seasons. Spring brought renewed travel after the long winter months. Summer filled the rivers with canoes and commerce. Autumn was often busy with preparations for colder weather. Winter transformed the landscape. Snow covered the prairie. Ice formed along waterways. Travel became more difficult, though not impossible. Daily life required constant effort. Food had to be gathered, stored, and prepared. Buildings required maintenance. Trade goods needed organization and protection. The frontier offered opportunity, but it demanded hard work. Yet there were rewards as well. The location provided access to valuable trade routes. The surrounding land offered natural resources. And perhaps most importantly, the settlement sat at the center of a growing network of relationships. Visitors often remarked upon the quality of Point du Sable's establishment. Accounts from the period suggest that his property was well managed and prosperous. This was not merely a remote outpost struggling to survive. It was a successful enterprise operated by a capable businessman who understood both the opportunities and challenges of the frontier. At the time, however, few could have predicted what the future held for this location. The settlement remained small. Beyond the buildings lay vast stretches of prairie and wetland. The sounds most commonly heard were those of nature. Birds calling from marshes. Wind moving through grass. Water flowing gently toward the lake. Even so, the seeds of growth had already been planted. Travelers who visited the trading post gained first-hand experience of the region's advantages. They recognized the potential of the location. Word spread. Maps improved. Knowledge of the area continued to grow. As the 18th century came to a close, larger forces were reshaping North America. The American Revolution had altered political boundaries. European empires continued competing for influence. Within this broader transformation, Point du Sable's trading post served as a small but important landmark. It demonstrated that successful settlement was possible. It provided a foundation upon which future communities could build. Eventually, Point du Sable sold his property and moved away from the Chicago area. Around the year 1800, he relocated westward, eventually settling near what is now St. Charles, Missouri. His departure marked the end of one chapter. Yet his legacy remained. The settlement he established continued to influence those who followed. The quiet trading post beside the river would gradually evolve into something larger. The site where Point du Sable once lived now sits within one of the largest cities in North America. Towering buildings surround the area. Millions of people pass through each year. The river is lined with bridges, walkways, and skyscrapers. Yet beneath all that development lies the memory of a much quieter place. Before Chicago became a city, before it became a transportation hub, before it became an architectural marvel, there was Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable. His trading post did not resemble the Chicago we know today, but it represented the beginning, the first permanent settlement, the first glimpse of a future city. As the 19th century began, the small settlement along the Chicago River remained modest in size, but its importance was slowly becoming impossible to ignore. The fur trading post established by Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable had shown that people could live, trade, and build a life in this unusual corner of the landscape. But empires and governments were now looking more closely at the region. The United States, still a young nation, was expanding westward. Its leaders saw the interior waterways and portage routes not just as distant geography, but as opportunities for connection, defense, and control. And so, in 1803, the U.S. government ordered the construction of a military outpost near the mouth of the Chicago River. It was called Fort Dearborn. The fort was named after Henry Dearborn, the U.S. Secretary of War at the time. Its purpose was simple: to establish a military presence in a strategically important location and to strengthen American influence in the Great Lakes region. To the soldiers who arrived to build it, the site must have felt remote. There were no nearby cities, no developed roads in the modern sense, only prairie, river, lake, and sky. The fort itself was constructed from wood, its buildings arranged in a simple defensive layout along the south bank of the Chicago River. It was not a large installation, but its position mattered far more than its size. From this point, control of the portage between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi watershed could be monitored, and control of movement meant influence over trade and travel. Life at Fort Dearborn was shaped by isolation and environment. Soldiers lived in close quarters. Supplies had to be brought in from distant settlements. The weather defined daily routines. In winter, snow and ice covered the ground, and the wind off Lake Michigan cut sharply across the exposed landscape. In summer, heat and humidity settled over the wetlands, and insects filled the air. Even simple tasks required effort and planning. Wood had to be gathered for fuel. Food had to be carefully rationed and stored. Repairs were constant, and beyond the fort walls, the landscape remained largely wild. Tall grasses moved in waves across the prairie. The river shifted slowly through marshy ground. Wildlife passed through open spaces where no roads existed. Yet Fort Dearborn was not completely isolated. The region remained home to indigenous communities, particularly the Potawatomi, who had long-standing ties to the land. Relationships between the fort and nearby native groups were complex. At times, trade and communication created moments of cooperation. At other times, tension and mistrust shaped interactions. These relationships were influenced by larger forces unfolding across North America, including shifting alliances, competition for land, and the growing presence of American settlers. For the soldiers stationed at Fort Dearborn, daily life continued with routine duties: guarding the fort, maintaining structures, managing supplies, and observing the surrounding environment. Travelers passing through occasionally brought news from other regions, but much of the outside world felt distant. Chicago at this time was still more concept than city. It was a location on maps, a meeting point between waterways, a place where paths crossed, but not yet a place of dense settlement. Even so, its strategic importance was clear. Water routes connected it to the Great Lakes, and from there to eastern cities like Detroit and Buffalo. To the west and south, rivers connected it to vast interior regions. It sat at the edge of multiple worlds. In 1812, however, this fragile frontier outpost would face a dramatic turning point. Tensions between the United States, Britain, and native nations had escalated into open conflict in what became known as the War of 1812. In the Great Lakes region, alliances and hostilities were deeply intertwined, and frontier settlements often found themselves caught in the middle of shifting power struggles. Fort Dearborn, isolated and vulnerable, became part of this larger conflict. As conditions worsened, military leaders decided to evacuate the fort in August of 1812. Families and soldiers prepared to leave the only structured settlement in the area. They planned to travel south towards safer territory. But the journey would prove dangerous. Not long after departing the fort, the group encountered a Potawatomi force along the lakeshore. The confrontation that followed became known as the Battle of Fort Dearborn. It was brief but devastating. Many lives were lost, and the fort itself was destroyed soon after. In the aftermath, the site returned once again to quietness. The wooden structures were gone. The settlement was gone, and for a time, Chicago was once again a sparsely inhabited landscape of river, prairie, and lake. Yet even destruction did not erase the significance of the location. When the War of 1812 ended, the United States retained control of the region. In 1816, Fort Dearborn was rebuilt on the same site, reflecting the continued strategic importance of the location. This second version of the fort marked a return of military presence and stability. Around it, however, the land remained largely undeveloped. A few traders and settlers returned. Indigenous communities continued to live in and move through the region. But Chicago was still far from becoming a town in any modern sense. It was a frontier outpost, a place of crossings and returns, a place where human presence came and went, but never yet fully settled into the dense pattern of urban life. Still, the pattern was shifting. Each rebuilding, each visit, each mapped route made the region more visible to the outside world. The idea of Chicago was slowly gaining definition, not as a city yet, but as a point of importance, a place where water routes met, a place worth holding, a place that would not remain empty forever. And as the rebuilt fort stood along the river, surrounded by prairie winds and open sky, the next phase of Chicago's transformation was already beginning to form beyond the horizon. By the early decades of the 19th century, the small settlement at the mouth of the Chicago River remained a frontier outpost, but it was no longer invisible to those who studied maps and trade routes. The United States was growing quickly. New states were being added. Population was moving steadily westward. And as settlers crossed the Appalachian Mountains and spread across the interior, one problem became increasingly clear: transportation. Roads over land were slow and difficult. Rivers provided natural highways, but they did not always connect in convenient ways. The great waterways of North America, the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River system, were powerful, but they were not fully linked. And so, attention once again turned to the quiet stretch of land where Chicago would one day rise. There, nature had already done most of the work. The Chicago River flowed into Lake Michigan. Nearby, other waterways led toward the Illinois River and eventually into the Mississippi. Between them lay only a short portage across relatively flat land. It was a gap in geography that invited imagination. What if water routes could be connected? What if goods could move continuously from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico? That idea became one of the most important visions in early Chicago history. It was called the Illinois and Michigan Canal. The concept had been discussed for years, even decades, but it began to take real form in the 1820s. In 1822, the United States Congress granted the territory of Illinois land to help fund the project. Local leaders saw the opportunity immediately. If a canal could be built, it would transform the region from a remote frontier into a central transportation corridor. Surveyors began studying the land between the Chicago River and the Illinois River more closely. They measured distances. They mapped elevations. They evaluated soil and water conditions. What they found confirmed what geography had already suggested. The route was feasible. Construction officially began in 1836. At that time, Chicago was still a very small settlement. A few hundred residents lived near the river. There were simple wooden buildings, dirt paths, and open stretches of prairie surrounding the settlement. Yet even in its small size, Chicago was already preparing for rapid change. The canal project attracted workers, investors, and settlers. Laborers arrived from nearby states and from overseas. They dug through soil using shovels, picks, and wheelbarrows. Work was slow and physically demanding. The terrain included soft ground, marshy areas, and unpredictable water levels. In some places, engineers had to build embankments to prevent flooding. In others, they needed to dig deeper channels to maintain consistent depth. Progress was uneven, often delayed by weather, funding shortages, and technical challenges. At times, the project moved forward quickly. At other times, it slowed or stopped entirely. But even during delays, the idea behind the canal continued to shape the future of the region. As workers labored along the proposed route, Chicago itself began to grow. The settlement at the mouth of the river was becoming more active. New arrivals came seeking opportunity. Some were merchants. Some were farmers. Some were laborers drawn by the promise of work on the canal. The population slowly increased. What had once been a small outpost began to take on the appearance of a town. Streets were still unpaved. Buildings were still simple. But the density of life was changing. The arrival of the canal project also brought new economic activity. Supplies were needed for construction. Food had to be transported for workers. Equipment had to be manufactured or shipped in. Chicago's position along waterways made it a natural distribution point. Goods arrived by boat from the east. Others came from overland routes. From Chicago, they could be transported further inland. This growing role as a transfer point began to define the town's identity. Even before the canal was completed, Chicago was becoming a hub of movement. Everything passed through. Nothing stayed still for long. By 1848, after years of effort, the Illinois and Michigan Canal was finally completed. It stretched over 90 miles, connecting the Chicago River to the Illinois River. When it opened, it fundamentally changed transportation in the region. Goods could now travel by water from the Great Lakes all the way to the Mississippi River system. The impact was immediate. Chicago's population began to rise rapidly. Merchants established warehouses. Ships filled the harbor. Farmers from surrounding regions brought grain and livestock to market. The town became a center of exchange between rural areas and distant cities. The canal did not just connect waterways. It connected economies. It connected regions. And it connected Chicago to the wider world. With new trade routes came new people. Immigrants began arriving in larger numbers. Irish laborers, many fleeing hardship at home, worked on canal construction and stayed in the region afterward. Others came from Germany and Scandinavia, seeking farmland or employment. Each group brought languages, traditions, and cultural practices that slowly became part of the growing town. Chicago's population was no longer static. It was expanding, diversifying, and reshaping itself year by year. The physical landscape was also changing. Where prairie once stretched uninterrupted, new roads and structures appeared. The river became busier with boats and barges. Wharves and docks lined the waterfront. The natural quiet of earlier decades was replaced by steady activity. Yet even as the town grew, it still felt small compared to what it would become. Most buildings were wooden. Fire risk was constant. Infrastructure remained limited. And much of the surrounding land was still undeveloped prairie. But the direction of change was now clear. Chicago was no longer just a frontier outpost. It was becoming a transportation center, a place where goods, people, and ideas converged. The canal had done more than connect two river systems. It had anchored Chicago into the future, and as water began flowing steadily through the completed channel, so too did the flow of growth into the young town beside Lake Michigan. By the middle of the 19th century, Chicago was no longer defined by what it once had been, a small trading post, a military fort, or even a canal town. It was becoming something faster, something louder, something constantly in motion. If the canal had connected Chicago to the wider world through water, the arrival of railroads would connect it through nearly everything else. Steel tracks began stretching outward from the city in all directions. East toward the industrial centers of the United States, west toward the open plains, north into the forests and lake regions, south toward the Mississippi and beyond. Chicago's geography, already valuable because of its waterways, now became even more important because it sat at the center of converging rail lines. Trains did not depend on rivers. They could travel through winter snow, across dry land, and over terrain that water routes could never reach. And so, Chicago transformed into one of the most important railroad hubs in North America. By the 1850s and 1860s, rail lines were arriving in rapid succession. Train whistles became a familiar sound across the growing city. Stations appeared along the expanding grid of streets. Cargo was unloaded, sorted, and reloaded almost continuously. What had once been a quiet riverside settlement was now a place of constant arrival and departure. And with railroads came one of the most important commodities in American history: grain. Farmers across the Midwest were producing enormous quantities of wheat and corn. But these goods needed a place to go. They needed a hub. Chicago became that hub. Grain from Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, Indiana, and beyond flowed into the city by rail. Once it arrived, it was stored in massive wooden structures called grain elevators. These elevators used mechanical systems to lift grain into tall storage bins, where it could be measured, sorted, and prepared for shipment. It was a system that allowed Chicago to become a central marketplace for agricultural production across the entire region. From Chicago, grain could be shipped east to cities like New York or west toward new settlements. It could also be processed locally, fueling mills, bakeries, and food production. The city became deeply tied to the rhythms of agriculture. Planting seasons, harvest seasons, rail schedules, shipping routes. Everything was connected through Chicago. At the same time, another major industry was growing rapidly on the outskirts of the city: livestock and meat processing. Railroads made it possible to transport animals from farms directly into Chicago. Here, they were processed in large industrial facilities known as the Union stockyards. Established in 1865, the stockyards became one of the largest livestock processing centers in the world. Cattle, pigs, and sheep arrived in massive numbers. They were processed with increasing efficiency, and the resulting meat products were distributed across the country. This industrial system reshaped not only Chicago's economy, but also its identity. The city became known for its production, distribution, and movement of essential goods. Rail cars, riverboats, and wagons filled the streets and rail yards. The soundscape of Chicago grew dense with activity. Metal wheels on tracks, steam engines releasing pressure, workers shouting directions across busy platforms. It was a city that rarely paused. And yet, beneath all of this industrial expansion, everyday life continued to evolve. Neighborhoods grew outward from the river and rail centers. Housing was built quickly, often from wood, to accommodate the increasing population. Immigrants continued to arrive in large numbers, drawn by work in railroads, factories, and stockyards. Irish, German, Scandinavian, and other communities settled into distinct neighborhoods, each contributing to the cultural fabric of the city. Small businesses appeared along growing streets. Bakeries, butcher shops, taverns, and general stores served the expanding population. Churches and schools were built to support families putting down roots. Chicago was no longer just a place of transit. It was becoming a place of permanence. Still, life in the city was not without challenges. Rapid growth meant limited infrastructure. Streets were often unpaved and muddy. Sanitation systems struggled to keep up with population increases. Fire risk remained a constant concern due to the predominance of wooden buildings. And industrial labor was physically demanding, often dangerous, and poorly regulated. Yet despite these difficulties, the population continued to rise. Because opportunity in Chicago was unlike almost anywhere else at the time. Wages were available for those willing to work. Land was still relatively accessible compared to eastern cities. And the transportation network ensured that goods and people could move in and out with ease. Chicago's position was becoming clearer with each passing year. It was a gateway, a transfer point, a central node in a vast and growing national system of production and exchange. By the time the Civil War ended in 1865, Chicago had already established itself as one of the fastest-growing cities in the United States. Its population had expanded dramatically in just a few decades. Its industries had become essential to the national economy, and its rail connections had made it a central meeting point for commerce across the continent. But even as the city grew taller and busier, it remained vulnerable. Most buildings were still constructed of wood. The city's rapid expansion had outpaced careful planning in many areas, and the combination of dense construction, industrial activity, and dry conditions in certain seasons created a dangerous environment. Chicago was powerful, fast-moving, full of opportunity, but it was also, in many ways, fragile. And as the city continued to expand outward and upward, few could have predicted how dramatically that fragility would soon be revealed. By the mid-19th century, Chicago was no longer just a place defined by trade routes, canals, or railroads. It was becoming something more complicated. A living, breathing city made up of ordinary daily routines, crowded streets, and thousands of small moments happening all at once. While industry and transportation shaped its rapid growth, it was everyday life that gave Chicago its texture. To understand the city during this time, it helps to slow down, to walk its streets not as an observer of major events, but as someone simply living within them. Imagine arriving in Chicago on a cool morning in the 1850s. The air near the river feels damp and earthy. Wooden sidewalks creak underfoot. Horse-drawn wagons pass along muddy streets, leaving deep tracks behind them. Smoke rises from chimneys scattered across a growing cluster of buildings. The city is still young, but it is already busy. Shopkeepers are opening their doors. Dockworkers are unloading cargo from boats along the river. Farmers from surrounding regions have arrived with wagons full of goods. And everywhere there is movement. Life in Chicago during this period was shaped by practicality. Most buildings were constructed quickly, often from wood, because demand for space was growing faster than permanent construction could keep up with. Homes were simple but functional. Many families lived in close quarters, especially in the rapidly expanding neighborhoods near the river and rail lines. Inside, daily life centered around routine tasks: cooking over open stoves, washing clothes by hand, carrying water from wells or pumps, heating homes with wood or coal. There were no modern conveniences, and much of the work required physical effort. Yet even in these conditions, communities formed and grew. Neighborhoods began to take shape, often influenced by the immigrant groups who settled in specific areas. Irish families, many of whom had arrived during or after the Great Famine, found work in construction, railroads, and municipal labor. German immigrants opened bakeries, breweries, and small shops. Scandinavian communities established churches and social organizations that helped maintain cultural traditions. These groups did not simply pass through Chicago. They built lives there. Children attended local schools, which were often modest buildings with limited resources but strong community support. Education was valued, even when conditions were difficult. Churches played a central role in social life. They were not only places of worship, but also gathering spaces for information, assistance, and cultural continuity. On Sundays, streets might feel quieter as families gathered for services in different languages and traditions. Throughout the week, however, the city remained active. Markets were especially important centers of daily life. Farmers brought produce into the city, selling vegetables, meat, and dairy products. Stalls lined busy streets, and bargaining was a normal part of commerce. The scent of fresh bread, smoked meat, and spices drifted through crowded marketplaces. Along the river, life moved at a different pace but with equal intensity. Boats arrived carrying goods from distant places. Dockworkers loaded and unloaded cargo in a steady rhythm. Warehouses stored grain, lumber, tools, and manufactured items. The river functioned as both a transportation route and a working space. It was not clean or quiet, but it was essential. Transportation within the city relied heavily on horses. Horse-drawn streetcars and wagons were the primary means of moving people and goods. Streets were often unpaved, becoming muddy during rain and dusty during dry periods. Travel could be slow, especially during busy hours when wagons crowded narrow roads. Yet despite these limitations, the city continued to expand outward. New neighborhoods formed along the edges of development. As space filled in, construction pushed further into surrounding land. This outward growth created a sense of constant change. A visitor returning after just a few years might find entirely new districts where open land had once existed. With growth came opportunity, but also challenge. Public services struggled to keep pace with population increases. Water supply systems were limited. Sanitation was not yet well developed. Waste management was inconsistent, and conditions in some areas were crowded and unsanitary. These realities shaped daily life in ways that residents had to adapt to rather than fully control. At the same time, there was a strong sense of energy and possibility. Chicago was a place where people could arrive with little and still find work. Railroads, factories, construction projects, and shipping industries created a steady demand for labor. For many immigrants and migrants from rural areas, the city represented a chance at a new beginning. Work was often long and physically demanding, but it was available, and that availability helped fuel Chicago's rapid population growth. Evenings in the city brought a different atmosphere. Gas lamps began to glow along streets and storefronts. Taverns and public houses filled with conversation and music. Families gathered in small homes after long workdays. The sounds of the city softened but never fully disappeared. There was always movement somewhere nearby. A wagon passing. A train in the distance. Footsteps on wooden sidewalks. Chicago did not sleep deeply in this era. It simply shifted into a quieter rhythm. Through all of this, the city remained unfinished. Its boundaries were still expanding. Its systems were still developing. Its identity was still forming. And yet, by the standards of the time, it was already one of the fastest-growing urban centers in the United States. A place defined not by a single moment or monument, but by the accumulation of countless daily lives. Each person arriving added another layer. Each street built extended the city further. Each business opened reinforced its role as a center of movement and exchange. Chicago was becoming a city not just of industry or transportation, but of people, living, working, building, and adapting together in a place that was still learning what it would become. And as the sun set over its growing streets and the lights of early gas lamps flickered to life, the city continued its steady transformation into something far larger than anyone standing there at the time could fully see. By the autumn of 1871, Chicago was a city in motion. It was growing quickly, expanding outward in every direction from the river that had once defined its earliest settlement. New neighborhoods had formed. Factories and warehouses lined the busy industrial corridors. Rail lines and docks carried goods in and out with steady rhythm. To many of its residents, the city felt full of possibility, energy, and momentum. But beneath that rapid growth was a hidden vulnerability. Much of Chicago was still built from wood. Sidewalks, homes, businesses, and even larger structures often relied on timber construction because it was fast, available, and inexpensive. The city had expanded so quickly that safety regulations and infrastructure improvements had not yet caught up with its physical size. And so, as dry conditions settled over the region that year, Chicago became more susceptible to fire than anyone fully realized. On the evening of October 8, 1871, a small fire began on the city's southwest side. The exact cause remains uncertain, though one popular account describes a fire starting in or near a barn belonging to the O'Leary family. What is known is that it began as something relatively contained. At first, it did not seem like an event that would define a city. But conditions were dangerous. Strong winds swept through Chicago that night, carrying embers from building to building. Wooden structures, dry from weather conditions, ignited quickly. Narrow streets and closely packed buildings allowed the fire to move with alarming speed. As the night deepened, the fire grew beyond control. Firefighters worked tirelessly, but they faced overwhelming challenges. Water pressure was insufficient in many areas. Communication systems were limited. and the scale of the blaze continued to expand faster than response efforts could manage. As the flames spread, entire blocks of the city were consumed. People fled their homes carrying whatever belongings they could gather in moments. Some escaped toward open areas near the river or lake. Others moved northward as the fire advanced from the southwest. The glow of the fire lit the night sky, visible for miles beyond the city. For many residents, it was difficult to comprehend what they were witnessing. Chicago, a city that had grown so quickly and confidently, was now being reshaped in real time by fire. The wind played a critical role. It shifted direction, carrying embers across streets and over buildings that might otherwise have survived. Each new ignition created another point of expansion. What began as a localized disaster became a city-wide crisis. The fire burned through the night and into the following day. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to ash and rubble. Commercial districts that had once been filled with activity were left unrecognizable. Warehouses, homes, hotels, churches, and public buildings were all affected. By the time the fire finally began to die out, large portions of Chicago had been destroyed. The human toll was severe, and tens of thousands of residents were left without homes. In the aftermath, the scale of devastation was difficult to fully grasp. The city's physical structures had been largely transformed into ruins. Yet even in this moment of loss, something else began to emerge. Survival. And then, gradually, recovery. People who remained in the city began to organize shelter, food, and aid for those affected. Temporary camps were established in open areas. Relief efforts came from nearby towns and distant cities. Supplies were sent in by rail and boat. Chicago, despite its destruction, was not abandoned. Instead, it became a center of response and rebuilding. One of the most remarkable aspects of what followed was the speed of reconstruction. Almost immediately after the fire, plans were made to rebuild the city. Surveys were conducted of the damaged areas. Debris was cleared, and discussions began about how Chicago should look in the future. There was a shared understanding that simply recreating what had existed before would not be enough. The fire had exposed weaknesses in construction, infrastructure, and urban planning, and so rebuilding became not only an act of recovery, but also an opportunity for transformation. New building standards began to emerge. Brick and stone replaced wood in many structures. Fireproofing techniques were developed and refined. Streets were redesigned. Water systems were improved. Fire response infrastructure was strengthened. In a sense, the fire became a turning point. Not because it ended Chicago's growth, but because it redirected it. The city that emerged afterward would be more durable, more organized, and more prepared for continued expansion. But in the immediate aftermath, the emotional reality was still heavy. Residents walked through burned districts where only fragments of buildings remained. Familiar streets were gone. Landmarks had disappeared. Entire sections of the city existed only in memory. And yet, even amid this devastation, Chicago's geographic advantages remained unchanged. The river still flowed through the center of the city. The lake still stretched to the east. The rail lines still connected it to the wider country. The fire had destroyed buildings, but not location, not access, not potential. And so rebuilding began not at the edge of a vanished city, but at the foundation of a persistent one. A city defined now not only by its rapid growth, but by its resilience. In the months and years that followed, Chicago would rise again from the ashes. But it would not return exactly to what it had been. It would become something new. And in that transformation, the fire of 1871 would remain one of the most important turning points in its history. In the quiet that followed the Great Fire of 1871, Chicago was no longer the city it had been only days before. Its streets were unrecognizable. Entire districts had been reduced to ash. Familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by open fields of rubble and memory. And yet, in the days that followed, something remarkable began to happen. Chicago did not disappear. It reappeared. Slowly at first, then with increasing certainty, people returned to what remained of the city. Some came back to salvage belongings. Others came to search for family members. Many simply came back because Chicago, even in ruin, was still home. And almost immediately, the process of rebuilding began. What made this moment unique in history was not only the scale of destruction, but the speed and ambition of what followed. There was a shared understanding among residents, business leaders, and city officials that Chicago would not simply restore itself to what it had been. It would become something stronger, something more permanent, something designed not just for the present, but for a future that now felt unavoidable. In the burned districts, surveyors began mapping out new street layouts. Debris was cleared in organized efforts. Temporary shelters gave way to more structured rebuilding zones. And gradually, plans emerged for a more resilient urban design. One of the most important changes was in construction materials. Wood, which had once dominated Chicago's buildings due to cost and availability, was now increasingly replaced by brick, stone, and later iron and steel. Builders and architects understood that fire-resistant materials were no longer optional. They were essential. As rebuilding continued, Chicago also began to experiment with new forms of architecture. The destruction had created an unusual opportunity. Large areas of the city were essentially blank slates. This allowed for innovation in how buildings were designed, spaced, and constructed. Streets were widened in some areas. Buildings were planned with greater attention to fire safety. And new engineering approaches began to emerge. Out of necessity, Chicago became a laboratory for modern urban development. At the same time, the city's economic engines never fully stopped. Railroads continued to bring goods in and out of the region. The Illinois and Michigan Canal still functioned as a transportation route, and Lake Michigan remained a vital connection to eastern markets. Chicago's geographic advantages had survived the fire completely intact. Only the built environment had changed. This distinction mattered deeply, because while buildings can be rebuilt, location cannot be replaced. Chicago still sat at the intersection of major transportation systems, still connected the interior of the continent to the Great Lakes, still functioned as a central hub for trade and movement. And so, investment returned. Rapidly. Within months, new construction projects were underway across the city. Within years, entire districts had been rebuilt. And within a few decades, Chicago would grow larger and more complex than it had been before the fire. One of the most visible signs of this transformation was the emergence of more advanced commercial architecture. Multi-story buildings began to appear more frequently. Engineers experimented with stronger internal frameworks. Elevators, still a relatively new technology at the time, made taller buildings more practical. This shift marked the beginning of something new in urban history, the early foundations of the modern skyscraper. As Chicago rebuilt, it also attracted increasing numbers of people. Workers came to help reconstruct the city. Immigrants continued to arrive in search of opportunity. Businesses saw the chance to invest in a rapidly growing urban center, and as population increased, so did the need for more efficient urban systems. Streets were gradually improved. Infrastructure expanded. Water and sanitation systems were upgraded in response to lessons learned from earlier overcrowding and fire vulnerability. The city was not just rebuilding structures. It was rebuilding systems. At street level, daily life began to feel familiar again, even as the city itself had changed. Markets reopened. Factories resumed production. Rail yards filled once more with activity. The sound of construction became constant, a backdrop to everyday life. Yet there was also a new sense of purpose underlying everything. The fire had become a shared memory, one that influenced decisions at every level of rebuilding. Chicago was no longer growing carelessly. It was growing deliberately, still rapidly, still energetically, but now with an awareness of fragility that had not existed before. As the 1870s progressed, the city began to take on a new identity, not just as a transportation hub, not just as an industrial center, but as a place capable of reinvention. That idea would become central to Chicago's future, because what had been rebuilt once could be rebuilt again. What had been destroyed could be redesigned, and what had once seemed temporary could be made permanent. By the end of the decade, Chicago was already larger than it had been before the fire. Its population was rising quickly. Its economy was expanding, and its skyline, still low by future standards, was beginning to show the first hints of vertical ambition. The fire had taken much from the city, but it had also cleared space for new ideas, new materials, new forms of building and living. And as the sun set over the reconstructed streets, there was a quiet sense that Chicago was no longer simply recovering from its past. It was building toward something entirely new. In the years following the Great Fire, Chicago did not simply rebuild itself. It reimagined itself. And nowhere was that transformation more visible than in the way the city began to grow upward. Before the fire, Chicago had been a city of horizontal expansion, spreading outward across the flat Midwestern landscape, stretching block after block across prairie and reclaimed wetlands. But after the fire, something changed in both necessity and imagination. The ground in the center of the city was limited. The demand for space was growing rapidly, and new technologies were quietly becoming available that would make vertical construction not only possible, but practical. This combination of pressure and innovation set the stage for one of the most important architectural revolutions in modern history, the rise of the skyscraper. At first, the changes were subtle. Buildings became slightly taller, then more structured, then more ambitious. Engineers and architects began experimenting with internal steel frameworks that could support far greater heights than traditional load-bearing masonry. Instead of walls carrying the full weight of a building, the structural load could now be distributed through a metal skeleton. This shift may sound technical, but its impact was profound. It meant buildings were no longer limited by the strength of their walls. They were limited only by engineering, materials, and imagination. And in Chicago, imagination was in no short supply. One of the key innovations that helped make tall buildings usable was the elevator. Earlier vertical buildings had been limited by the physical effort required to climb stairs. But with safe and reliable elevator systems, upper floors suddenly became practical spaces for offices, businesses, and residences. Height was no longer a burden. It became an advantage. As these technologies converged, Chicago found itself at the center of architectural experimentation. The city's rebuilding after the fire had left large areas open for redevelopment. This created opportunities for new designs to emerge without the constraints of older structures. Architects began to think differently about urban space. Not just how buildings should look, but how cities could function vertically as well as horizontally. By the 1880s, a new kind of building was taking shape in downtown Chicago. One of the earliest and most influential examples was the Home Insurance Building, completed in 1885. Designed by engineer William LeBaron Jenney, it is often considered one of the first skyscrapers in the world due to its steel frame construction. It was not especially tall by modern standards, but at the time it represented something entirely new. A building that rose higher not because its walls were thicker, but because its internal structure was stronger. This was a turning point. Other architects quickly followed. Buildings began to climb higher into the sky. The skyline of Chicago, once flat and modest, started to develop a new vertical dimension. Stone and brick facades still gave these buildings a traditional appearance, but inside, their structure was modern and innovative. The city was learning how to build upward. As more skyscrapers appeared, the nature of urban life began to shift. Businesses could now occupy multiple floors within a single building. Office work became concentrated in vertical clusters. Elevators created new patterns of movement, organizing people not just across streets, but between floors. Even the experience of sunlight and air changed in the downtown core, as taller buildings began to cast longer shadows across surrounding streets. Chicago was no longer just a growing city. It was becoming a layered city, a city with depth as well as breadth. At the same time, this architectural transformation was closely tied to Chicago's identity as a center of commerce and industry. The same economic forces that had filled the city with railroads and warehouses were now filling it with offices, financial institutions, and corporate headquarters. The skyscraper became a natural expression of this energy, a physical representation of ambition, efficiency, and density. And Chicago was uniquely positioned to lead this transformation. Its flat geography made construction easier. Its rebuilding after the fire provided open space for experimentation. Its economic role as a transportation and trade hub created constant demand for centralized business districts. All of these factors came together in a way that few other cities could match at the time. By the end of the 19th century, Chicago's skyline was no longer a scattered collection of low-rise buildings. It was beginning to form a recognizable urban silhouette. Taller structures clustered near the river and rail corridors. Steel frameworks supported rising towers. Elevators carried people upward into increasingly complex buildings. The city was beginning to look like something new in human history, a vertical metropolis. Yet even as Chicago rose upward, it remained deeply connected to the forces that had always shaped it. Railroads still brought goods into the city. The river still carried traffic through its center. The lake still linked it to eastern markets. And beneath the rising skyline, the same geography that had once supported prairies and portages still defined its location. The skyscraper did not replace Chicago's foundation. It built upon it. And as the city continued to grow taller, it also grew more confident in its ability to reshape itself. What had begun as a recovery after disaster had now become a model for modern urban development. Chicago was no longer just rebuilding. It was leading. And the sky above the city, once an open horizon over prairie grass, was now becoming a new frontier. By the closing years of the 19th century, Chicago had transformed itself in ways that would have been almost unimaginable only a few decades earlier. It had rebuilt after fire. It had risen into the sky with early skyscrapers. It had become a national hub of railroads, industry, and commerce. And now, it was preparing to present itself to the world. In 1893, Chicago hosted the World's Columbian Exposition, more commonly known as the Chicago World's Fair. It was an event designed not just as a celebration, but as a statement. A declaration that Chicago was no longer a young frontier city. It was a modern metropolis. The fair was held to mark the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas, but its true significance lay in what it revealed about Chicago itself. The chosen site for the exposition was a vast area along Lake Michigan. Where there had once been open land, architects and planners created an entirely new city within the city. It was known as the White City, and for a brief moment in time, it seemed almost unreal. Grand buildings rose in uniform neoclassical style, their white facades glowing in sunlight during the day and illuminated softly by electric lights at night. Wide boulevards stretched between massive exhibition halls. Reflecting pools and canals created a sense of calm symmetry. Everything was carefully designed to evoke order, beauty, and harmony. At a time when real Chicago was still industrial, noisy, and rapidly growing, the White City presented an idealized vision of what an urban environment could be. It was temporary, built largely from plaster and staff, but its influence would last far longer than its physical structures. Visitors arrived from across the United States and around the world. They came by train, by boat, and by carriage, entering a city that seemed to exist apart from ordinary reality. Inside the exposition grounds, they encountered displays from dozens of countries. Exhibits showcased new technologies, manufactured goods, art, agriculture, and scientific discoveries. Electricity was one of the most striking features of the fair. For many visitors, this was their first time seeing an entire city illuminated by electric light. Streets, buildings, and fountains glowed after sunset, transforming the night into something bright and unfamiliar. The fair introduced many people to inventions that would later become part of everyday life. Moving walkways, new agricultural machinery, advanced communication systems, architectural innovations that would influence urban design for decades. It was a place where the future felt visible and tangible. But the fair was not only about technology. It was also about imagination. Architects like Daniel Burnham and others involved in its design believed that cities could be planned intentionally, with beauty and order guiding their structure. The White City reflected this belief. Symmetry, balance, and monumental scale were used to create a sense of calm grandeur. In contrast to the crowded, industrial reality of Chicago itself, the fair suggested what a planned modern city might look like. Visitors often experienced both worlds in a single trip. They would walk through the ordered elegance of the exposition grounds, then return to the busy, working streets of Chicago just beyond. The contrast was striking. One world suggested ideal design. The other revealed industrial reality. And yet both were part of the same city. The World's Fair also had a deep cultural impact. It attracted millions of visitors over its 6-month run. It helped establish Chicago as a global city rather than just a national one. And it influenced architecture, city planning, and design philosophy far beyond the United States. Perhaps most importantly, it reshaped how people imagined urban life itself. Cities were no longer seen only as organic, chaotic places that grew without direction. They could also be envisioned, designed, and refined. Chicago stood at the center of that shift in thinking. Meanwhile, the city outside the fairgrounds continued its everyday life. Railroads still carried goods through massive terminals. The stockyards still processed livestock on an enormous scale. Neighborhoods continued to grow and diversify as immigrants arrived from across Europe. Factories and warehouses operated steadily along river and rail corridors. The contrast between the White City and the real city was not a contradiction. It was a reflection of Chicago's dual identity. idealized vision and industrial reality existing side by side. When the fair ended, most of its buildings were dismantled. The White City itself was temporary, but its impact remained. It had demonstrated what modern urban planning could achieve. It had introduced millions to new technologies and ideas, and it had given Chicago a lasting place in the global imagination. In the years that followed, Chicago continued to grow rapidly. Its skyline became more complex. Its neighborhoods expanded further outward. Its role in commerce, transportation, and industry deepened. But something had changed after 1893. The city was no longer just building itself. It was also thinking about how cities should be built. And that shift in perspective would shape everything that came next. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Chicago, Illinois, United States had become something far larger than the frontier settlement it once was. But perhaps the most defining transformation of this era was not found in its buildings or industries. It was found in its people. Chicago became, in a very real sense, a city of arrivals. In the decades following the Civil War and into the early 1900s, waves of immigrants came to the United States in search of stability, opportunity, and a place to build new lives. Many of them made their way to Chicago almost immediately upon arrival. The city's rail connections, factories, and stockyards offered something essential: work. And so, neighborhoods began to take shape not just by geography, but by language, culture, and shared experience. On the near West Side, Irish immigrants settled in large numbers, many working in construction, municipal labor, and railroads. They built churches, social halls, and tight-knit communities where news from home could be shared and preserved. In other areas, German immigrants established bakeries, breweries, and small businesses that quickly became central to daily life. Bread, beer, and family-run shops were not just economic activities, they were cultural anchors. Scandinavian communities, including Swedish and Norwegian families, formed neighborhoods where churches and mutual aid societies helped newcomers adapt to life in a rapidly changing city. Further south and west, Polish immigrants created some of the largest ethnic enclaves in the city, often centered around parish churches that served as both spiritual and community hubs. Bohemian, Czech, and other Central European groups added further layers to the city's cultural fabric. Each community brought its own traditions, foods, languages, and celebrations. And yet, despite these differences, there was a shared experience that connected them all. Chicago was a place of labor, a place where long hours in factories, stockyards, rail yards, and construction sites shaped daily life. Work was often difficult and physically demanding, but it was also a path forward. Families often lived in crowded housing near workplaces to reduce travel time and costs. Streets were busy, especially near industrial districts. Children played in alleys and open lots between buildings. Markets operated on corners where vendors sold fresh produce, meat, and household goods. The sounds of the city reflected its diversity. Multiple languages could be heard within a single block. Church bells, factory whistles, and street vendors calling out goods created a layered soundscape that defined urban life. Amid this rapid growth, social reformers began to pay closer attention to living conditions in the city. One of the most influential figures of this period was Jane Addams. In 1889, she co-founded Hull House on Chicago's near West Side, one of the first settlement houses in the United States. Hull House was designed to provide services and support to immigrants and working-class families. It offered education, child care, language classes, and cultural programs. But perhaps more importantly, it served as a place of connection, a bridge between different communities within the city. Visitors to Hull House encountered lectures, art exhibits, and discussions about social issues affecting urban life. It became a center for reform efforts, helping to highlight challenges such as housing conditions, labor rights, and public health. At the same time, it reflected something deeper about Chicago itself, a city still learning how to support the people who built it. Outside of reform efforts, daily life continued to evolve in neighborhoods across the city. Ethnic enclaves were not isolated from one another, but they often maintained distinct identities for generations. Over time, however, interactions between communities increased. Children attended public schools together. Workers labored side by side in factories and stockyards. Markets served increasingly diverse customers. And gradually, cultural exchange became part of everyday life. Food was one of the most visible expressions of this blending. Bakeries introduced new styles of bread. Markets offered ingredients from many different traditions. Home cooking reflected both Old World recipes and New World adaptations. Religious life also shaped the city's identity. Churches were not only places of worship, but also centers of education, charity, and social life. They helped newcomers maintain cultural continuity while adapting to American urban life. Meanwhile, the physical city continued to expand outward. Streetcar lines extended neighborhoods further from the downtown core. New housing developments emerged on previously open land. Industrial districts grew along rail corridors and waterways. The city was no longer a compact core surrounded by prairie. It had become a vast, interconnected urban region. Yet even as it expanded, Chicago remained closely tied to the industries that had fueled its growth. The stockyards on the south side processed enormous numbers of cattle, pigs, and sheep, drawing workers from many of the same immigrant communities that filled nearby neighborhoods. Factories operated across the city, producing machinery, steel, textiles, and consumer goods. Railroads continued to bring goods and people into the city at a steady pace. Everything was connected. Work, home, transportation, and commerce formed a continuous system. Life in Chicago during this era was often demanding, but it was also full of movement and possibility. For many immigrants, the city represented both challenge and hope. It required adaptation. It demanded resilience. But it also offered the chance to build something new. By the early 20th century, Chicago had become one of the most diverse cities in the United States. Its neighborhoods reflected a mosaic of cultures layered across streets and districts. Its economy depended on the labor and contributions of people from around the world. And its identity was shaped not by a single tradition, but by many traditions living side by side. The city was no longer defined only by railroads, canals, or architecture. It was defined by the people who filled its streets. People who arrived with memories of other places. People who built homes in a rapidly changing environment. And people who, together, transformed Chicago into a city not just of industry, but of communities woven tightly together along the edge of a great lake. By the early decades of the 20th century, Chicago, Illinois, United States had fully entered its industrial prime. The railroads that once defined its growth now pulsed continuously through the city like arteries of steel. Factories stretched across wide districts. The stockyards still processed enormous numbers of livestock. And the skyline, now denser and more confident, reflected a city comfortable with its own scale and complexity. But alongside industry and commerce, something else was taking shape in Chicago during this period. A cultural rhythm, a new sound, a new way of experiencing the city itself. This was the era of jazz, nightlife, and transformation, the Roaring Twenties. The 1920s were a time of contrast in Chicago. On one hand, the city remained a powerhouse of manufacturing and transportation. On the other hand, it became a center of music, entertainment, and urban culture that defined much of America's modern identity. The sounds of industry still dominated the daylight hours. Steam whistles, rail cars clattering across bridges, machinery running deep inside factories. But as evening arrived, a different soundscape emerged. Music drifted from clubs, dance halls, and street corners. Jazz, in particular, became one of the defining cultural forces of the city. It had traveled north during the Great Migration, carried by African American musicians and communities who brought new musical traditions from the South. In Chicago, these traditions evolved and expanded. Improvisation, rhythm, and expression blended into a style that felt both rooted and new. Neighborhoods on the South Side became especially important centers for jazz performance. Clubs and venues offered spaces where musicians could experiment and audiences could gather. The music was energetic, fluid, and constantly evolving. It matched the pace of the city itself. At the same time, Chicago was living under the influence of Prohibition, which began in 1920 with a nationwide ban on the production and sale of alcoholic beverages. This period reshaped nightlife across the United States, and Chicago was no exception. Legal restrictions did not eliminate demand. Instead, they shifted it into underground spaces. Speakeasies, hidden bars operating outside the law, became part of the urban landscape. These venues were often concealed behind ordinary storefronts, basements, or unmarked doors. Inside, music played late into the night. Jazz bands performed for crowded rooms. Conversation, laughter, and rhythm blended together in dimly lit spaces. The atmosphere was both secretive and vibrant. While Prohibition is often remembered for its connection to organized crime, it also had a broader cultural impact. It changed how people socialized. It influenced architecture and interior design of nightlife spaces, and it helped shape the cultural identity of cities like Chicago during the 1920s. But Chicago in this era was not defined solely by nightlife. It remained deeply industrial at its core. The stockyards on the South Side continued operating at massive scale, processing livestock from across the Midwest. Factories produced machinery, steel components, textiles, and consumer goods that were shipped throughout the country. Railroads still anchored the city's economy, ensuring constant movement of goods and people. This industrial foundation supported everything else happening above it. The music, the nightlife, the cultural innovation. It all existed alongside the machinery of production, and this coexistence gave Chicago a unique identity. It was both working city and cultural city at the same time. The Great Migration continued during this period as well, bringing large numbers of African American families from the rural South to northern cities like Chicago. They sought opportunity, safety, and stability. In Chicago, they built communities, churches, businesses, and cultural institutions that reshaped the city's social landscape. Music was one of the most powerful expressions of this transformation. Jazz clubs became places not only of entertainment, but of creativity and identity. Musicians experimented with new styles and sounds that would influence music across the country. Chicago became one of the key cities in the development of American jazz. Meanwhile, the physical city continued to evolve. Skyscrapers grew taller and more refined. Steel frame construction became more common. Elevators and modern building systems made vertical expansion more efficient. The downtown area grew denser, with financial institutions and corporate offices occupying increasingly prominent buildings. Transportation within the city also changed. Automobiles became more common, gradually reshaping street design and traffic patterns. Streetcars still operated widely, but the presence of cars signaled a new era of urban mobility. Neighborhoods expanded outward as transportation allowed people to live farther from where they worked. This created a more distributed urban landscape, stretching Chicago further across the flat Midwestern terrain. Despite its growth, the city still carried the weight of its earlier history. Industrial districts remained active and often harsh in working conditions. Economic inequality was visible across neighborhoods, and tensions between different communities occasionally surfaced in the crowded urban environment. Yet even amid these challenges, Chicago continued to function as a place of opportunity and reinvention. The Roaring Twenties were not simply a period of celebration. They were a moment of acceleration. Industry grew. Culture expanded. Technology advanced. And Chicago stood at the intersection of all three. By the end of the decade, the city had become one of the largest and most influential urban centers in the United States. Its identity was no longer tied to a single role. It was not just a transportation hub, not just an industrial center, not just a cultural city. It was all of these things at once. A place where the rhythm of machinery and the rhythm of music coexisted. A city that moved quickly during the day and transformed itself at night. And as the 1920s came to a close, Chicago stood poised on the edge of another dramatic shift in American history, one that would test its resilience once again. As the 1920s faded into memory, Chicago, Illinois, United States entered one of the most difficult periods in its modern history. The energy of the Roaring Twenties gave way to uncertainty. The stock market crash of 1929 marked the beginning of the Great Depression, a nationwide economic collapse that would shape daily life across the United States for more than a decade. In Chicago, a city built on industry, transportation, and constant movement, the effects were immediate and severe. Factories slowed or shut down. Rail traffic declined. Construction projects stalled. And unemployment rose sharply across neighborhoods that had once depended on steady industrial work. For many families, the change was abrupt. Work that had once been plentiful became scarce. Paychecks disappeared. Savings were quickly exhausted. And the systems that had supported rapid growth in earlier decades now struggled to meet basic needs. Chicago's stockyards and factories, once symbols of industrial strength, were deeply affected by reduced demand and economic contraction. The flow of goods through the city slowed noticeably. Warehouses that had once been full of activity became quieter. Rail yards that had been constantly busy began to feel still. Yet even in this period of hardship, Chicago did not stop functioning. It adapted. Neighborhood communities became even more important as families relied on one another for support. Churches expanded their role as centers of assistance, offering food, shelter, and basic services where possible. Local organizations and charities worked to distribute aid, and informal networks of neighbors helped fill gaps left by larger systems under strain. Daily life became more constrained, but also more communal in many areas. People shared resources more carefully. Meals were simpler. Homes were maintained with fewer means. But life continued, even under pressure. One of the defining features of Chicago during the Great Depression was the visible contrast between its industrial infrastructure and the struggles of its population. The city still contained massive rail networks. Tall buildings still stood in the downtown core. Factories still existed across industrial districts. But the level of activity within those systems had changed dramatically. Machines that once ran continuously now operated intermittently or not at all. The physical city remained, but its pace had slowed. At the same time, Public works programs introduced during the New Deal began to reshape parts of Chicago. Federal initiatives created jobs through construction projects, infrastructure improvements, and urban development efforts. Roads were repaired and expanded. Bridges were maintained or upgraded. Public buildings were constructed or renovated. These projects provided employment for many residents while also improving the city's long-term infrastructure. In this way, even during economic hardship, Chicago continued to evolve physically. Its foundations were strengthened in ways that would support future growth. The 1930s also saw continued migration into the city, though at a slower pace than previous decades. People still arrived seeking opportunity, even if conditions were more difficult than before. Chicago's established communities often absorbed newcomers, continuing patterns of cultural diversity that had defined the city for generations. Meanwhile, cultural life persisted in new forms. Radio became an increasingly important medium, connecting households to news, music, and entertainment. Despite economic struggles, people found ways to maintain connection to broader cultural life beyond their immediate surroundings. Sports also played a growing role in public life during this period. Baseball, in particular, became a source of shared identity and distraction from economic hardship. Games offered moments of collective experience, where attention shifted away from daily struggles and toward competition and community pride. As the decade progressed, conditions slowly began to improve. By the late 1930s, signs of recovery were visible in certain sectors. Employment began to stabilize in some industries. Public works continued to support infrastructure development, and the city gradually regained momentum, even if unevenly. But the Great Depression left a lasting imprint on Chicago. It reshaped expectations about stability. It reinforced the importance of public support systems, and it revealed the vulnerability of even the largest industrial cities to global economic forces. When the United States entered World War II in the early 1940s, Chicago once again shifted into a new role. Factories that had slowed during the Depression were reactivated for wartime production. Industrial capacity was redirected toward manufacturing vehicles, machinery, and materials needed for the war effort. Railroads again became heavily used for transport, and the city's workforce expanded as demand increased. In many ways, the war marked the end of the Depression-era's stagnation and the beginning of renewed industrial activity. But Chicago did not return simply to its previous state. It had changed. Its infrastructure had been tested. Its communities had adapted to hardship, and its role in the national economy had been reshaped by both crisis and recovery. By the early 1940s, Chicago stood ready for another transformation, one driven not only by industry and transportation, but by a changing world order that would redefine cities across the United States. And as it had done before, Chicago would continue moving forward, shaped by challenge, but never defined by it alone. By the time the Second World War came to an end, Chicago, Illinois, United States was once again in a period of transition. The factories that had been retooled for wartime production now shifted back toward consumer goods and peacetime industry. Railroads remained active, but the rhythm of national life was changing, and for the first time in decades, a new force began to reshape the structure of American cities: the automobile. In earlier eras, Chicago had grown outward along rail lines and streetcars. Now, growth followed highways. Roads began to extend farther from the urban core, making it possible for families to live at greater distances from where they worked. This shift gradually transformed the shape of the city itself. Neighborhoods that had once been tightly packed around industry and rail corridors began to spread outward into surrounding suburbs. Entire communities formed beyond the traditional city limits, connected by roads rather than rails. the idea of Chicago expanded beyond a single dense urban center. It became a metropolitan region. At the same time, the city's infrastructure entered a new phase of modernization. Expressways were constructed to move increasing volumes of traffic through and around the urban core. These highways cut across older neighborhoods and reshaped familiar patterns of movement. Commuting became a defining feature of daily life for many residents. The center of the city remained important for business and commerce, but more people began living farther away from it. This changing geography reflected a broader shift in American life during the mid-20th century. Post-war prosperity, rising car ownership, and new housing developments all contributed to suburban expansion. But Chicago itself remained a powerful economic and cultural center. Its downtown continued to grow vertically, with taller and more modern skyscrapers replacing older structures. In 1973, one of the most recognizable additions to the skyline was completed, the Sears Tower, later known as Willis Tower. For a time, it was the tallest building in the world. Its steel frame structure and bundled tube design represented the next stage in Chicago's architectural evolution. The city that had once pioneered early skyscrapers in the 1880s was now helping define what skyscrapers could become in the modern era. From the riverbanks, the skyline appeared denser, sharper, and more vertical than ever before. Yet even as Chicago reached new architectural heights, it also faced significant social and political challenges during this period. The mid-20th century was marked by major civil rights struggles across the United States, and Chicago was no exception. African American communities, many of whom had arrived during the Great Migration earlier in the century, continued to advocate for fair housing, equal opportunity, and better living conditions. Housing segregation and economic inequality were persistent issues in many neighborhoods. These tensions sometimes erupted into public demonstrations and conflict, especially during the 1960s. One of the most well-known moments came during the 1968 Democratic National Convention, held in Chicago. Protests surrounding the event drew national attention. Demonstrators and police clashed in the streets near the convention site. The events became symbolic of broader social divisions in the country during that era. At the same time, Chicago continued to evolve culturally. Music, particularly blues and soul, remained deeply rooted in the city's identity. Artists who had migrated from the South helped shape Chicago's musical landscape, influencing genres that would spread across the country. Neighborhood culture remained vibrant, even amid political and economic tension. Ethnic communities that had formed earlier in the century continued to exist, while new waves of migration added further diversity to the city. By the late 20th century, Chicago was a complex mosaic of neighborhoods, each with its own history and identity. In addition to social change, the city also underwent major developments in transportation and aviation. O'Hare International Airport, which expanded significantly during the post-war period, became one of the busiest airports in the world. It connected Chicago to national and global destinations, reinforcing its role as a major transportation hub in the modern era. This expansion of air travel marked another layer in Chicago's long history of connectivity. From portage routes to canals, from railroads to highways, and now to air corridors, the city had always been defined by movement. But by the late 20th century, not all of Chicago's changes were growth-oriented. Like many industrial cities in the United States, Chicago experienced economic restructuring. Manufacturing jobs declined as industries shifted to other regions or became more automated. Some neighborhoods faced population loss and disinvestment. Industrial areas that had once been central to the city's economy became quieter. Yet even during these challenges, Chicago remained resilient. The downtown core continued to develop, with new office towers, financial institutions, and cultural landmarks. The city invested in redevelopment projects along its lakefront and riverfront areas, transforming former industrial spaces into public parks and mixed-use districts. Museums, universities, and cultural institutions expanded their presence, reinforcing Chicago's role as a center of education and arts. By the end of the 20th century, Chicago was no longer defined by a single industry or era. It was defined by layers. Railroads and factories from the 19th century, skyscrapers and industrial growth from the early 20th, highways and suburbs from the mid-century, and a modern skyline supported by finance, culture, education, and global connectivity. Each layer remained visible in some form, woven into the city's geography and identity. And through all of these changes, the underlying pattern remained the same as it had been since the earliest portage routes beside Lake Michigan. Chicago was a place of connection, a place where systems met, a place where movement shaped everything. As the 20th century came to a close, the city stood not as a finished story, but as an ongoing one, still evolving, still adapting, still shaped by the same forces that had guided it from the beginning: water, land, people, and the constant flow between them. By the beginning of the 21st century, Chicago, Illinois, United States had already lived many lives. It had been a trading post beside a muddy river, a military fort on the edge of a vast frontier, a canal town connecting two great watersheds, a railroad hub binding the continent together, a city rebuilt from fire, a birthplace of the skyscraper, a global stage for industry, culture, and migration. And yet, even after all of that, it was still changing. Modern Chicago is no longer defined by a single transformation. It is defined by layers of them. Walking through the city today, it is possible to see traces of every era at once. The river still flows through the center, but now it is lined with walkways, bridges, and reflective glass towers. The skyline still rises in steel and stone, but its silhouette continues to evolve with each new decade of construction. Historic buildings stand beside modern glass facades, each representing a different moment in architectural history. The city is no longer building itself from scratch. It is building on top of itself. One of the most visible symbols of this continued evolution is Chicago's skyline along Lake Michigan. The same lake that once served voyagers, traders, and early settlers now frames a dense concentration of high-rise buildings that reflect sunlight and weather in constant motion. The lakefront, once industrial and heavily used for shipping, has been reshaped into parks, public spaces, and recreational paths. What was once purely functional space is now shared space, a place where the city meets water, but also where people pause, walk, and gather. Transportation remains one of Chicago's defining characteristics, just as it always has been. Highways, commuter rails, and airports now layer over the older systems of canals and railroads. The city is a network of movement at multiple scales. People commute from suburbs that stretch far beyond the original city limits. Air travel connects Chicago directly to the rest of the world through one of the busiest airport systems in the United States. And freight still moves through rail corridors that trace patterns established more than a century ago. Chicago has not replaced its older systems. It has expanded them. Economically, the city has also shifted. While manufacturing still exists, Chicago is now deeply connected to finance, technology, healthcare, education, and global trade services. The industrial core that once defined its identity has been partially replaced by a more diversified economy. But the logic of connection remains unchanged. Chicago still thrives because it connects systems, people, goods, information, ideas. Just as it once connected river systems through a short portage, It now connects global systems through infrastructure, industry, and technology. Culturally, the city remains one of the most diverse in the United States. Neighborhoods continue to reflect layers of migration from different eras. Earlier European immigrant communities remain part of the city's identity, while newer arrivals from Latin America, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East have added new dimensions to its cultural landscape. Languages, cuisines, traditions, and festivals coexist across districts that continue to evolve over time. Food, especially, remains one of the clearest expressions of Chicago's layered identity. Deep historical traditions meet constant reinvention. Old recipes persist in family-owned establishments, while new culinary movements reflect global influences. Chicago's cultural identity is not static. It is continuously recomposed. At the same time, the city continues to confront challenges that are both modern and familiar. Economic inequality remains visible across neighborhoods. Infrastructure requires constant maintenance and renewal. Questions of housing, transportation, and urban development continue to shape public debate. These are not new problems for Chicago. They are recurring ones, expressed differently in each era of its history. What makes the city distinct is not the absence of challenges, but its repeated ability to adapt to them. Education and research institutions also play a major role in the modern city. Universities, museums, and scientific centers contribute to both local identity and global knowledge. They anchor parts of the city in long-term thinking, balancing the constant movement of commerce and transportation. Chicago's relationship with architecture continues to evolve as well. The skyscraper, once a radical innovation, is now a standard feature of its identity. But new approaches to design, sustainability, and urban living continue to reshape how buildings are imagined and used. The skyline is no longer just a symbol of height. It is a reflection of changing priorities, efficiency, livability, and environmental awareness alongside ambition. And yet, despite all modernization, the underlying structure of Chicago's geography remains the same. The river still runs through its center. The lake still defines its edge. And the flat Midwestern landscape still allows the city to expand outward in all directions. That original geography, the meeting point of water systems, the crossroads of movement, still shapes everything. From indigenous portage routes to global logistics networks, the pattern has never truly changed. Only the scale has. Today, Chicago is not a finished city. It is an ongoing process. A place where past and present exist side by side, where history is not only preserved in museums or landmarks, but embedded in streets, neighborhoods, and infrastructure. A place that has been rebuilt, reimagined, and expanded again and again. And perhaps that is the most accurate way to understand it. Chicago is not a story that ends. It is a story that keeps adapting. From prairie wind to river portage, from trading post to skyline, from fire to rebirth, from industry to global city, and still, always, something new taking shape just beyond the horizon. If there is a single way to understand Chicago, Illinois, United States, it is not as a completed place, but as an ongoing process. Across its history, Chicago has never remained still long enough to become fixed in one form. It has shifted repeatedly, sometimes slowly, sometimes violently, sometimes with remarkable speed. From a small meeting point of river and lake, it became a trading post where goods and ideas moved through open land. From there, it grew into a military outpost at the edge of expanding national territory. Then a canal town, reshaping the logic of transportation across an entire region. Then a railroad capital, where steel lines converged and redistributed the movement of a continent. Then a booming industrial city, dense with factories, stockyards, and warehouses. Then a city destroyed by fire and rebuilt from the ground up. Then a birthplace of the skyscraper, where human ambition began to rise vertically into the sky. Then a global metropolis shaped by immigration, culture, and constant reinvention. Each version of Chicago did not erase the one before it. It layered over it. Even now, all of those versions still exist in subtle ways. You can still trace the old river routes in the city's geography. You can still see the logic of railroads in the placement of industrial corridors. You can still feel the impact of rebuilding in the structure of downtown streets. And you can still sense the ambition of early skyscrapers in the way the skyline continues to evolve. Chicago is not a city that replaces itself. It accumulates itself. One of the most consistent themes throughout its history is movement. Water once carried canoes across portage paths that defined its earliest importance. Canals formalized that movement into engineered connections. Railroads expanded it into a national system. Highways extended it outward into suburbs and neighboring states. Air travel extended it globally. And digital systems now overlay all of that, connecting Chicago to networks far beyond geography. At every stage, the city has functioned as a point of transfer, a place where things arrive, change form, and move onward. But movement alone does not explain Chicago. Just as important is the way people have continually reshaped it. Generations of immigrants arrived with little more than hope and determination. They built neighborhoods, businesses, schools, churches, and cultural traditions that became inseparable from the city itself. No single group defines Chicago. Instead, it is defined by the accumulation of many groups over time. Irish, German, Scandinavian, Polish, Italian, African American, Latin American, Asian, Middle Eastern communities, all contributing to a constantly evolving identity. Chicago is not one culture. It is many cultures living in proximity, overlap, and exchange. This layered identity is also visible in its physical form. The skyline is not a single architectural statement. It is a record of different eras of engineering and design. Stone and brick from earlier centuries still stand beside steel and glass towers. Historic buildings remain integrated into modern redevelopment. New construction rises not in place of the old, but alongside it. Even its challenges have followed this same pattern of persistence and transformation. Economic shifts, industrial decline, population changes, and social tensions have all shaped different periods of the city's history. But none of them have defined it completely. Instead, Chicago has repeatedly adapted, sometimes through rebuilding, sometimes through reinvention, sometimes through gradual adjustment. What remains constant is its ability to continue, to respond, to rebuild, to reimagine. In that sense, Chicago is less like a finished structure and more like a system that never stops recalibrating itself, always adjusting to new conditions, always integrating new people, industries, and ideas, always finding a way to remain relevant in a changing world. And that may be why its story feels unfinished, even after centuries of development. Because there is no final version of Chicago. There is only the version that exists right now, and the version that is already beginning to form just beyond it. As the lights reflect off Lake Michigan and the river continues its steady path through the center of the city, Chicago carries forward the same pattern it has always followed. Arrival, transformation, movement onward, from prairie wind to industrial smoke, from fire to reconstruction, from steel rails to glass towers, from local crossroads to global city. And still, it continues. Not because it has reached its destination, but because it was never meant to have one. Chicago is not a story that ends. It is a story that keeps unfolding, quietly, constantly, and without pause, into whatever comes next. Good night.